I posted a video last night for those of you who have seen it. Tonight is another special episode of another majestic INFJ. We have our friend of the channel, Shane Starr. Say hi to everybody, Shane.
Right.
Shane's got his own channel out there. We'll put a link to it below once I get all this posted, where he also does his own diving into the typology world, and it's a little bit more expansive on his channel. He talks about other, um, protocols or methods like Enneagram and DISC and all that. So, anyways, say hi, Shane.
Hi, everyone. That you're watching, if you are, and if you're watching after the fact, that's fine too. Looking forward to sharing some good information.
Yeah, and I guess comments are open, but better be nice or I'm going to block you. Um, okay, so what we wanted to do is just sort of banter about um, the polar testing method in typology, and um, the pros and cons, mostly the pros of using that method as opposed to maybe some other methods. And for those of you who might be new to this that aren't really familiar with what we're talking about, it might be a good, sort of gateway or opening, you know, lesson on, what's going, what the aim is, what the goal is with polar testing, and sort of the logic behind it, and then some examples of how it helps really pinpoint somebody's type. At least under this particular model. Full disclosure, ahead of time, there's plenty of models out there that use the MBTI terminology, thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensing, that maybe this isn't going to work in the same way. But if you sort of think about cognitive functions, at least in the way that I do, and I'm going to presume that Shane does, then it's a good method, and works pretty well. And of course, to give credit where credit is due, as far as I know, this is stems from talking with famous people, and host Eric, who does a whole litany of typing, has a whole set of typing sessions on his channel where he walks people through this type of testing, and
That we've both
determines
been
their
through.
cognitive. And we've both been through it, right? So we're veterans. Um, okay, and I'll of course put a link, to his channel as well. Um, and I just want to put out there, we're going to be talking about it. It's pretty much his method that he's honing and has honed over the course of the years. But of course, we're not talking for him. We're just, sort of outside observers to the process. Okay. Um, Anything else? Any other sort of intro remarks or anything you wanted to talk about, or do you want to just dive right into it?
I would just say that the overall purpose of this discussion, besides entertainment, is to really come up with or actually reveal the method that we're discussing. Eric Strauss's Typing with Famous People is the main proponent of it, and that is typing through the polar function. That's the point of least resistance, one's worst function, and pinpointing their personality type using that method as opposed to searching for the lead function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a good analogy to sort of understand sort of the logic behind it. A good analogy is to think of what we would call in the field neuropsychology, a neuropsychology method, which is basically taking patients who have particular areas of brain damage, and then figuring out what they cannot do versus the general population, because then that tells you that that part of the brain is connected to whatever function it is they have a problem with, right? So let's say you're studying memory and you want to learn how do people, how does memory work and how does memory work in the brain and how do people use memory, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's two things you could do. You could go out and find a bunch of people who have really, really good memories, right? And test them and try to see what they're good at, and come up with some ideas about and some theories about memory and how it works by using them. But that's somewhat limited, because all you're doing is just sort of, I don't know, what we call affirming the consequent. You're just sort of piling data on top of each other and not really looking at what sort of the underlying cause is. So the alternative is you find people who have a deficit in a particular cognitive ability because of some sort of brain lesion or something, and you test them in different ways and see what they can do and what they can't do, and then it tells you what that underlying part of the brain is doing. Okay, and so the defensible typology or Eric's method of doing the polar testing is sort of in line with that, right? It's not pinpointing parts of the brain or anything, but what it is doing is seeing, okay, what can you do and what can you not do, and then it turns out that the 16 different types, each of us has a function that is sort of a quote unquote blind spot, polar function, weak function, however you want to think of it. And when you hone in on that, then you can figure out, oh, okay, they're going to be one of two types. Okay, because there are two types that share, each polar function, which we'll talk about. So, any thoughts on that? Anything you want to add to that?
Not really. What I'm hoping to do, I'm ready to get right into it and start
Okay.
with the dichotomies that we discussed earlier and come up with what some examples of polar function testing would look like.
Yeah.
We'd start with the real examples that we have and then move on. Maybe I could suggest some things, and then maybe those are things that you've seen with Eric's channel that you could bring out, or we could just discuss it and check the comments and see what others think.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I wanted to mention as well, sorry that this is like 15 minutes of introduction, but another thing I wanted to mention is I posted a video last night on my channel that was intended to go through various definitions and terminologies and to sort of explain Eric's model and how there's four different types of functions and computational processes. And even though we're using thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition, we kind of mean different things than a lot of other models do. So I invite people to watch that video because I don't want to spend the whole time really explaining, just sort of what we mean by a knowledge function or an interact or an interface function or an action function or a deliberation function. But we're going to be talking about that. And if it's not really making sense, feel free to watch that video to sort of get some background. Um, so I think, it might be a good idea. We should let everybody know, I did the test, you did the test with Eric. I came out as an INFJ, and I feel pretty confident with that. He actually had another one of his assistants that was also helping, and they both pretty much agreed. Yeah, this is an INFJ. There were plenty of people watching it and leaving comments that didn't believe it at all. They all thought I was an INTJ or an ENTJ, and that's fine. The J-ness comes through, obviously. But I feel pretty comfortable with it, having gone through the session, and especially that polar test, which we'll talk about. And then you also did a session where you came out as ISTJ, and it's interesting because you know you're polar in one of the interfacing functions, extroverted feeling, where I'm polar in the other interfacing function, extroverted thinking. And so it might be a good idea to just start with our own personal examples to talk about, or to give some background and some description how that plays out. It showed that we had this sort of lack of interfacing function. So I'll hit it over to you to give your account.
Right. As soon as I get my lighting right.
Oh,
um,
all right.
okay.
Okay.
Um, the first disclaimer is that, I think one's type depends on the system that one is using and being tested on. Between you have Socionics Classical, you have Socionics Model A, there's objective personality, there's different versions of MBTI testing, and ours, we're talking about something specific. So if someone's arguing about
Yeah.
my type or your type, that's subject for another discussion. I think in this case, using Eric's system, I think we were both pretty clear. And, those may or may not translate. I don't think mine translates to a socionics typing. And so anyone from that discipline watching, I don't want them to just shut it down based on that. You know, um,
Okay.
to look at the method that we're using, and then they can use the same application to their own discipline with great effectiveness.
Okay. I did get a comment here that my microphone is a little weak. It's my phone. I apologize. I usually don't use my phone. If it continues to be a problem, just let me know. But I'm just going to try to talk louder. Hope that works. Okay, and thanks for letting me know. Okay, go ahead. So let's talk about your experience in the testing session.
Okay, so when I got typed by Eric, I didn't have very much experience with his methods. So when he came at me with these scenarios and different questions, it was quite I would say intense, because you're, usually in typing videos, people ask you what you like to do, what you're interested in, all these positive scenarios. But with Eric,
Right.
it was more like a psychological exam, Um, who's your brother's mother's uncle's sister's mom to you, and if
Right.
you're polar PI, you're just going to be lost right there, um, he was asking questions, an octopus meets a fish in the water, what happens next? And if you're polar NI, you can't think thematically, you can't build a story in MBTI, at least, you're
Right.
going to be lost, and so we went down the list, and at some point, we did talk about what I did for a living, which is I manage apartments, and that's in Orange County in Southern California. And we talked about a little bit off the air about what goes into my job, and part of it is renewing leases. And anyone living in an apartment nowadays knows that rents go up substantially, way more than they did 5 or 10 years ago. In the past they would go up like $100. Now they're going up $400-500, so your lease is up and you think, okay, I'm just going to have to sign my renewal and I'm on with it, and you get hit with a $500 increase, and that's not good news for anyone. And Eric asked me, how do you deal with that? What do you do when someone comes in your office upset and angry and sad, and they want to strike out at someone? How do you talk to them? And I thought, oh, wow, I can answer this real easy. And the way I deal with that is I show them market trends on a national level, market trends in California, market trends in Southern California, and then I show comparable rates around town and in our own apartment complex. And I say, I understand nobody likes this, but comparatively speaking, you're not getting a bad deal. We're all in the same boat here. And it was at that point, I think, that Eric started zeroing in on me having a little bit of trouble with my FE, understanding,
Yeah.
because I thought I answered the question perfectly. And I found out later, I gave a TE answer to an FE problem. And
Yeah.
with some people it works, and others,
Yeah.
you know, I'm like, how come they're upset? I showed them all the numbers. I showed them the truth. Why are they still mad at me? I don't create the math. I don't create the the state of affairs. I'm sharing information. They should
Yeah.
be happy and appreciative, but they aren't for some reason. And um, yeah, that was eye opening. That was my experience. I'm interested
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
hearing yours after a moment.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of underscore your point, so we have two interfacing functions, right? You know, TE and FE. And TE is about long-term planning with mechanical processes, you know, systems, that kind of stuff that aren't people, right? Where FE is a totally different part of the brain. Well, it's, you know, it's close to the TE part, but it's a different system. And it, you know, it evolved to deal with people, right? To interface with people, because people are not machines, and people you have to, you know, you have to throw in some emotion, you have to, you know, deal with the feedback loops of, you know, how are they reacting to what I'm saying, and how do I adjust on the fly, because you're trying to get a person to do something, you're interfacing with a person. And so, you know, I think, you know, his question was, you know, try to ask you, okay, or try to, you know, explore how do you interface with people, right? When there's a tough situation, or, you know, something you need to deal with, um, and like you said, you know, you did what I call domain shifting, where you're presented with a scenario in your polar domain, and so you shift it to the other, you know, similar function, right? The other interface function in this case, right? So, you know, I did something similar, with in mind. And again, you know, I came into this not expecting to come out as INFJ or anything like that. You know, I had been formally tested with MBTI a couple of times and came out as INTJ both times. Um, and then, of course, you know, the online test and everything. But once you sort of kind of think you know your type, you know, once you do an online test, you can cheat and figure out, you know, get the type that you want. And so that's another reason why this is a good, you know, method, is you really can't cheat it in that way. So, anyways, so, you know, we're like you, we were just sort of humming along, and I had seen pretty much all of his videos on typing, you know, so I was very familiar with his process and what many of the questions were getting at, and, you know, hadn't really thought about it too much. And then he just sort of hits me with this TE question, and he's like, you know, explain to me, you know, in you know, it's the fewest number of steps or whatever, how to build a hot air balloon. Okay. And I could just personally remember just going blank, you know, like being in class when like the teacher asks you a question you don't know the answer to, and I'm just like, I don't know, you know. And I did what all of the FE polar or the TE polar types tend to do, and that was say, you know, I'll try to find somebody who can explain to me how to do it, right? And I think I said something like, you know, I'll try to find some YouTube channel or something that will explain how to make a hot air balloon, or I'll try to find somebody that I know. And he's like, no, this is not phone a friend. And, you know, and again, it was sort of this like shifting the domain from a TE interface question to making it more of an FE question. Because if, you know, you have, if you're an INFJ or you have FE in your second function, you're much more likely to be able to convince somebody to help you build the hot air balloon than to figure it out how to do it yourself, right? And, and then I did the other thing, the other sort of classic thing that FE or TE polar types do, where I started with like try like, okay, well, we have to go buy the material, right? Like we have to go to Home Depot or some carnival store, you know, something, and like buy all the material. And for whatever reason, we get obsessed with INFJs get obsessed with finding the material, and I don't know if it's like a stalling tactic or what. Um, And but after a couple of minutes, like he just sort of realized, and he and then the other guy Isaac, who was helping, you could kind of see them realize, like, oh, he really fell off a cliff on that one. And I don't even think he even followed up with another TE question. I think he was pretty convinced that I was TE polar at that point, and then it just became a question of whether I was an ISFJ or an INFJ. Um, from there on out. I don't remember. Maybe he did ask me a couple of follow up questions. I don't really remember them, to be honest. Um, so, anyways, there's our two examples of you know being prodded in that way, where you really do sort of either you sort of fall off a cliff because you don't know how to answer the question, or you misinterpret the question as being like maybe in your case, where it wasn't about like how do you engage in your FE, and more about oh well, this is a real life problem in a real life scenario. Here's what I would do. And of course, I would approach it in a TE way and not an FE way. And it's also funny because that's sort of the classic knock on people who are FE polar, ISTJs and INTJs, is that sometimes people just want to come to you and vent, right? And they just want to lay out all their problems, and the classic INTJ or ISTJ response is, "Oh, well, here's how you fix that. Here's a solution. Why don't you just do this, right?" And they're not really asking you for a solution or something to fix it or data or whatever. They just want to vent, right? And they just want somebody to listen to them and say, "Yeah, the world is a horrible place." Um, and I think that was sort of the classic example of that as well.
Yeah, and I would say for FE at least, it comes out in relationships as well. And I think gender has something to do with this also, but just wanting to fix problems instead of letting a person feel like they've been heard. Immediately go into that TE mode of, you're in this situation. First you do A, then you do B, then you do C, and then from the answer there, you either go to D or E, depending on what happens, and then your problem is solved. So let's move on.
Yeah.
And
So
even if
that's how they
even
would
if the
hear
logic is there, it doesn't have the effect that we want it to have sometimes, and it's kind of mind boggling if you don't have that FE. Now, again, I want to remind people I'm fully aware that in socionics, this might sound more like FI, personal relations.
yeah.
And FE would be more expressive behavior. But just throwing that little disclaimer in there in case someone is watching thinking, "Oh, this is trash. These guys don't know what they're talking about." We're talking about MBTI systems in this video. We
Yeah.
could do a socionics
Well,
conversation another time.
even more specifically, the defensible typology method. And if you have any questions about how that works, there's thousands of videos on Eric's channel explaining it, from soup to nuts. But yeah, we'll probably get our fair share of socionics bros, parachuting in and letting us know that, you got to have these 40 different qualities or something to be an INFJ or whatever. And that's fine, they have fun doing that. And that's all part of the fun. But I think from the defensible typology method and approach, I think both of us would agree, being Jays, that it's a practical approach. It's an approach that makes sense. There's got a lot of logical consistency to it. And it's defensible. Like you said.
Right.
So,
So
okay.
I just
Anything
wanted
more you want to say on that?
I just
Yeah, go
wanted to
ahead.
say someone mentioned that a TE polar test would be to give someone some furniture and put it together, like, the
Oh yeah,
famous, infamous
yeah.
IKEA furniture
Oh
directions.
yeah,
I
definitely.
think, even though that's funny, that rings, there's a lot of truth to that. And I'd like
Oh,
to jump
definitely.
in with some possible TE polar questions, and that would be
Sure.
one of them. And I think another one would just be, simply, all of this is relative. If you can't type yourself or other people without a, a pre-existing structure or framework of other people around it. So you ask someone in a group of your friends who who is most likely to be able to put together the furniture, you, or do you
Right.
need to leave it, are you the go-to guy for that, or is your brother or best friend or your dad or your uncle or someone else? I think when people lack a, I don't want to say a follow through, because INFJs and ISFJs can have follow through, but there's a certain lack of detail. I know this will be an unpopular example, but I can't help it. I read a lot of World War II memoirs and stories, and
Mhm.
one of the things that was so frustrating to the German generals was the way their leader would make these grandiose plans that sounded plausible, it sounded good the way he told them, but he lacked all the follow through, attention to detail, the specifics. How do you get, okay, I get you want to go from point A to point Z, but how do we do that? And so you had situations where he invaded a country, and it was winter time, and he forgot to provide the soldiers with winter clothing, and that
Yeah.
error in and of itself was a large factor in them losing the war. And this leader happened to be an INFJ, at least according to typology,
Yeah.
typing.
I mean, if we're thinking about the same person, I don't know if I agree they're an INFJ. I think they're a little too fiery, but
Perhaps
I always think ENFJ. But I get the point, right? Like it's the in my mind, to me,
logistics.
what's that? Go ahead.
I said logistics, the lack of the
Yeah,
details that it takes to successfully execute a plan. The
yeah,
plans are always great, but it's how practical is it in the real world? And that's,
yeah.
I think, I use a historical example, but furniture is an example.
Mm.
Planning a business, um, you know, working on a car, all those things can be examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, really anything that is just sort of a mechanical, linear, ordinal process. I mean, I always use the example of IKEA. I honestly have put maybe three, four, maybe five things together from IKEA, and every single one of them I did it wrong and had to like take it apart and redo it. Um, and because I look at the instructions and then I look at all the pieces, and in my mind I'm just kind of like, oh well, all the pieces just sort of fit together like this, right? And I don't need to follow these instructions because that's boring. Um, and so like my intuition sort of gets ahead of me, and then I just I don't want to go through the whole TE process of it. And it's funny. I mean, you mentioned the what if in a group of friends, who's going to be the person who can't put it together, and I don't know if that would be the case with me or not, because I mean, apart from that kind of stuff, you know, I do stuff, right? And so, and I've been through academia and all that, and have had a professional job for a long time. And I think it would surprise people if I told them, yeah, I can't put together a piece of furniture. They're like, well, you do all this other complicated stuff. But it's like, well, that's TI stuff. That's not TE stuff. It's TI and NI stuff. And, I could do that. And so, I guess my point is that as you get older, you kind of find ways of sort of hiding your polar function, I think, from people. They probably aren't aware of it. Anyways, okay. So, I mean, I think we've, covered pretty good ground here on the interface function. And one thing I want to point out is, to note that we're comparing TE and FE as opposed to comparing TE to TI or FE to FI, because TE and FE are interface functions, right? And if you're an IJ, one of those is going to be polar and the other one's going to be your tool function. And so this is another way to sort of contrast this approach to most of the approaches you see out there, or most of the online banter discussion you see when it comes to typology, is people will get fixated on, is this person an FE person or an FI person? Or are they a TE person or a TI person? And I don't think that that's the right way of thinking about it. I think it's better if you sort of put the pieces together in the right way and think about it in the right way. It's better to think of it as, is this a TE user or an FE user, right? And then similarly, we'll move on to the next set here. The knowledge functions, are they an SI user or an NI user? And this is typically what Eric is going to start off his sessions with, is trying to figure out, because I think it's the easiest thing to sort of piece apart or pick apart, is whether somebody's an SI user or an NI user, because those are the knowledge functions, and which sort of knowledge function you typically rely on. And so you and I probably had a pretty stark contrast on that, because you're obviously an SI user and I'm an NI user, and both of us are dominant on that. So we had a very
Right.
different.
Let,
So go
let,
ahead.
let me explain what happened. He started off my conversation with him by asking me when's the last time I went to the market and what did I get. And I told him, I got a pack of veggie patties, a pack of veggie chicken patties. I got a pack of mixed vegetables. I got 10 yogurts, so I could eat two on each day. I could tell you the flavors. I also got some peanut butter and jelly and thinly sliced wheat bread, but I got the that's Olympic bread with seeds. And then my guilty pleasure is Haagen-Dazs ice cream, and I got one strawberry and one vanilla. And he said, okay, tell me about a vacation you went on. And I told him last year I did, and he asked me my favorite part of it. And I was able to just tell him with specific detail what I wore. I have some Adidas outfits that I wore. One day I wore the red and orange and black, and the other day I wore the yellow, blue, and black. And he was just like, okay, we're done with this. And I'm like,
Right.
what? Like,
And the
what?
fact that you can do this now is also telling, of your
I mean,
dominant SI.
it's just weird. It doesn't seem odd to me, but when I watch other people just say, well, I don't know, I don't remember what I was wearing. It's like, I could tell you what I was wearing any day,
Yeah.
or what I bought or what I ate. I could tell you with exact detail what I had today, why I didn't have more or less, when I ate, how many coffees I had in. So that was an SI test. Now, again, SI and this system has a lot to do with memory and attention to detail like that.
Yeah.
Not all systems see SI as that, but
Yeah.
this one does. And on that score, I think I kind of hit that one out of the park. So that
Right.
was nice.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was clear that at your front stack SI, right? I don't think he had to do much teasing, and he probably didn't even push you much on the NI tests, because you were so clearly SI
He
that
He did give
Yeah.
me
Go
the
ahead.
NI test to make sure that that wasn't my polar in his system.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. That
again,
makes
in
sense. Yeah.
socionics, NI has more to do with time, whereas, in Eric's and other MBTI based systems, it has more to do with thematic concerns, planning, overall patterns. And of course, there's some overlap there, but there are distinctions as well. And so, With my
Yeah.
NI example, he asked me to finish a story he started and I just ran with it. Had a story, had a theme or a lesson to the story, said, okay, that's not your puller. And we were done.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, again, I mean, SI and NI under this model are knowledge functions, right? So it's how you're storing your information about the world. And when you reach into it, what do you pull out, right? Do you pull out these sort of episodic memories where it's almost like you're rewatching, you know, reliving the event, or do you pull out just sort of abstract, sort of general concepts of what happened, right? And so with me, you know, they were doing some SI stuff, and they were asking, what'd you do this morning? They, got up, had a shower, got dressed, went to work, you know. And I was like, oh, but today was odd because my battery was dead, so there at least was something that I remember about this morning. Um, and but and then they were asking me like, have you seen a movie lately? And I had seen a couple of movies in the theater, and I think like Joker and Once Upon a Time in the West or something. And they're like, okay, well, which one did you see first? And I couldn't remember. I honestly couldn't remember, and to this day, I still can't remember like which one I saw first. Um, and and so I think at first they kind of thought that it was SI Polar. If you rewatch the video, there's a point where Eric was thinking I was probably an ENTJ because my SI was so dismal. Um, but I guess I convinced him it was enough to not be ENTJ. Um, and and I was just so clearly TE polar that there's no way I could be an ENTJ and that'd be my dominant function, right? Um, so again, I mean, the testing or the prodding or the evaluation of somebody's type is not, are you an NI versus an NE user, or are you an SI versus an SE user? It's an NI versus SI. These are knowledge functions, and what type of knowledge do you pull out when asked about your day, or some sort of event that happened to you? And NI users, they just, for the most part, will give you the highlights, right? Like they don't feel like the details are necessary, and chances are the details aren't even really there unless they really thought about it and had to turn on that backstack SI. And yeah, I mean, you could tell pretty quickly in most videos if somebody is SI, front stack SI, because he'll just let them go,
Yes.
it just,
You know,
just give as
you
much detail as possible.
you have a great example of that when you took some Colin Farrell clips in your analysis
Right.
of the Penguin series. And they
Yeah.
were asking him several SI questions, and it was like pulling teeth. That guy would not give a detailed answer to anything. Everything was
Yeah.
like a sweeping overgeneralization, for better and for worse. Like you
Yeah.
ask him
It's almost like,
what he thought of
you
his
know,
costume, his outfit. And he's like, well, it just the vibe on the set was this and that. And it's like, to me, he's like going into the clouds, like taking a specific question and turning it into a general thing. And it was
yeah.
weird. It was like a kite without a string. He would just
Yeah.
go up and run with it. And it great
And
analysis.
yeah. Yeah. And then you contrast him to the director when he was asked a question, and he went on for, I timed it at some point, and I think he went on for like 7 or 8 minutes straight, just telling this story of, how they, with the whole Batman and, and who, or in the Penguin series, and who they casted and everything. And he said this, and then I said this, and we were like, whoa, and then he said this, and I said this, and you just walked you through each detail. And so you contrast those two types, and you really get a sense of, okay, what is SI versus what is NI? Because yeah, with Colin Farrell, it's like you don't even know if he was even there. The way he
Right.
was reacting. They would ask him, hey, tell me about, the day that you found out that they were going to make this into a TV series or something. And he was like, oh, yeah, so and so called me and said we're going to make it into a TV series. And oh, man, I just love her. I just was so happy because I love working with her and I just love the cast. And and just like, he just couldn't give you any detail about that particular day. So, yeah, that's a good example. And when you hone in on that, you see it everywhere, right? I mean, when you start talking to people, and it only takes a couple of prods, to get them on their SI wavelength, right? And so, so if you're wondering if somebody's an ISFJ or an ISTJ, it's pretty easy to get them on that wavelength if you just ask them a couple of questions, about the details on something, and they'll unload.
Right. So I think for a good way to start tuning in to see if someone is perhaps SI polar would be first of all, a lack of attention to detail, which in and of itself won't identify them as this, but that's the first sign. Also, I think a neglect of things that are the daily grind. Ask someone about their chores. So, what do you think of taking out the trash and doing dishes? And like, an ENTJ or an ENFJ, they're so far from that. They're not going to talk about it. They don't remember. They don't care. If they're rich, they have
They're
someone
they're in
else
the
taking
future.
care of that.
Their
But
mind is constantly in the future. Yeah,
right. Those things are like beneath them in some way. And like with me, I have a list of things to do with my chores listed, and I get great satisfaction crossing each one off every day. I even put
yeah,
stuff on my list that I've already done so I can cross it off and feel good about it. Um,
yeah,
SI polar, not at all. They don't think about it. And that extends to self-care as well. Unfortunately for them, a lot of times they don't realize they're getting sick. They don't realize when things, supplies are running out. A lot of times
yeah,
don't they don't feel the warning signs in time to prevent sickness or burnout or other negative things. And so I think for identifying SI polar, I think those are the kinds of questions you want to key in on. Besides memory, just how do you deal with the daily grind? How do you
yeah,
know do that? I'm curious, since you would be more of an expert on NI than me, what kind of things you would look for if someone was anti-polar. Um, yeah, take that and run with
yeah,
it.
yeah. Antipolar is funny. Um, it, in a weird way. So couple of examples. One thing I did want to just sort of jot in there is, I'm 8 slot SI, and so I'm sort of guilty of a lot of that polar SI stuff too, like not really taking, like getting sick out of nowhere, that kind of stuff, and that can also be 8 slot SI as well. But you have to sort of triangulate and look at all these different tests together. Um, but okay, so NI polar. So I think of NI as, I have a whole video on this of it's basically the function in the brain that solves the frame problem. And I'm not going to get into with all that right now because it will take way too long to explain. But for those of you playing at home, look up the frame problem. Look up Dan Dennett's example of the robot, and NI and NE sort of work together to figure out how to solve the frame problem. And that's basically, you've got, so much information stored in your brain, about so many different things, and you have to sort of sift through it in real time, really quickly, and figure out what's relevant, right? What's relevant to this situation right now, this context. And yeah, it's built off of associations, it's built off of pattern recognition, just like, all the YouTube videos say. But its ultimate goal or its ultimate purpose from a computational standpoint is to sift through the irrelevant stuff and find the relevant stuff. I think is sort of its core purpose. Okay. Um, and and without it, um, it's very hard for people to focus on what's relevant. And you hear Eric talk about this because I think his dad was an ESTJ, and so he's got a lot of these, sort of anecdotal, this word I'm trying to say, stories where, his dad would sort of focus on things that are relevant. Okay. And so here's where I see it pop up because I work with a lot of ESTJs and a lot of ESFJs, and I just happen to know a lot of them as well. And when you put an ESFJ or an ESTJ who are NI-polar um, into a situation where there's a large amount of uncertainty, right? And they've never dealt with this situation before, right? So they don't have the SI experiential knowledge to figure out what to do. Okay. And they're so used to it because they're SI and either TE or FE. So they're so used to being goal oriented, very reliable. They usually know what to do in any given situation because they've got this, lead TE, lead FE that sort of guides the way, and they've got usually a pretty robust SI that they built along the way. And so the real high power, high firing ESTJs that are like CEOs of companies or ESFJs, they're used to being large and in charge, right? And then as soon as you put somebody like that in a situation where it's a completely new situation and they've never had to deal with it before, and now all of a sudden they have to figure out, okay, what's going to happen? They lose it. they go into like all these what if scenarios. Like, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? Because they have the IMI, right? And so they can think of the what if scenarios using their IMI. But what they have a difficult time doing is figuring out what's relevant, right? And are you really worried about that happening? Like, what are the odds of that happening? Yes, it's possible that could happen, but is it reasonably likely to happen? Is it worth spending all this time and energy worrying about it? And they'll be like, "Well, yeah, yeah," and until you can tell them at sort of an SI level, right? You bring in the world's expert and you tell them, okay, this is going to be fine because here's 100 studies or here's 100 articles that will show you that this is how this works. Then they'll take a deep breath and get comfortable. And so here's a good like real world example of this. So I had a friend she's an ESFJ, and she was having some sort of weird situation with a family member, like an uncle or something, and they sort of had a falling out. And this uncle, for whatever reason, was very like protective of her, and he, you know, put like a tracking system in her car. Okay, and she was kind of getting weirded out because she was like, yeah, every time I'm at work, he's texting me and asking me how's work. Or if I'm out doing something else, he's like, hey, where are you? What are you doing? And it's like every time I leave the house, he's texting me. So, and like immediately, because I'm lead intuitive, I'm just like, well, he's probably tracking you somehow, right? And so she was like, well, I don't know, right? Because she didn't have the SI proof of it, right? And so she even found like a tracking program on his computer and on his phone. She found a bill from Amazon where he ordered a tracker. And, it's I don't know, maybe it's me, I don't know. And then eventually she had to take her car in because it kept overheating, and they found the tracker under the engine, right? And it wasn't until then that she was absolutely like that she was convinced, oh yeah, he's actually tracking me, right? Like she refused to just like use her intuition to come to the conclusion that this guy was tracking her until like she had rock solid proof like right in front of her, right? And to me, that's it. I call it the you know like the inability to just sort of put two and two together, or to sort of look around the corner and come up with a conclusion, and sift out all the irrelevant information and just focus on what's likely to happen, and going with that conclusion. So long story, but I think it's pretty telling.
Right. There's some good comments there too that I would agree with about some of the issues with NI-polar. But before we get into those, this is probably anecdotal, but I noticed that NI-polar people in this system and other MBTI systems are the least likely people to be interested in typology. And
Yeah,
every
yeah,
ESTJ I know who I've talked to about, you know, um, their type, they don't care. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm this, so what?
right. Well,
They're like,
shouldn't
dude, you're
everybody
getting too deep. And it's just like, wow, I'm not getting that deep. I'm just looking at your personality type, it's not like I'm doing rocket science here. I'm just trying to see what type you are. Okay, I'm this one. Okay, let's move on. Like they don't like to go deep into anything. They're too
yeah,
busy or something.
yeah, and it's really funny because you see this in the business world all the time, where the the HR folks or the business development folks, they're all super into MBTI and DISC and all of that. They love this stuff. I love talking to them about it, right? And then you'll get the ESTJ bosses who will say, "Yeah, okay, fine, we'll do this because they think it sort of checks off some DEI box or something, right?" And so they sort of humor it, and then everybody will do like the MBTI test or whatever test they use, DISC or whatever. Um, and we had this situation in one of the places I worked before, where they came in and they had this whole intricate personality system, and it broke people down into basically five types, and it was kind of like an oceans model, but it was this company's own little take on it. And we all had to do it. We all had to like go to these classes and learn about how different people, different lawyers approach, being a lawyer differently. Some people just want to be in their room and in their office and just do their work, and they don't want to go out and do client development. Other people are just, they're just great client developers, but they don't want to be stuck in the office all day, right? And so it's this whole spectrum of things, and we were supposed to, appreciate all the differences in everybody, and and they were even talking about like sort of gearing people's professional track, like what are we going to ask you to do, and sort of base it off of the personality. And then about 2 or 3 weeks into it, all the ESTJs who run the place are just like, yeah, we don't want to do that's too different. We've been running this place the same way for 100 years. Why would we change it now? And again, like they just didn't get it intuitively, right? Like what the value was, unless somebody comes to them and says, "Oh, every other firm in the country is doing this, and so you better be doing it too." And the ones who do it, they increase their profits by 20% or 25%, because now they have real SI/SE data, right, to back up their decision, and it's not just this sort of NI, trust me, I'm an INFJ, this will work kind of argument, right?
Right.
So, okay, so those are the SI NI polar types. Um, I guess we could move on to the other sort of function types, unless you had more to say about these types.
No, I'm ready to get into TI and FI. I have
Yeah,
a lot of ideas about both of these and how to identify people of these types.
sure. Okay, well, did you want to start lead off?
Well, yeah, I would just say, something I like about looking for FI polar is I do think in this case there is a lot of overlap between Eric's system and others. And I think a good way to just pinpoint if someone may be FI polar is two things. Number one, the inability to rank their likes and dislikes. Ask someone what their favorite cars are, the first five, and they'll have a real difficult time to do that. Or their favorite people. I've heard it said before that FI polar types are the people with the most frenemies, people who they're not sure if they're their friends or their enemies. And it's really this inability to categorize or rank things, their likes, their dislikes, their preferences. They have a real difficult time with that. And as a result, they end up ruining a lot of relationships, either by deceiving others or being deceived by others, or misjudging an enemy as a friend or a friend as an enemy. And if you ask someone about their life experiences, I think it's a quick way to zero in on the possibility of there being FI polar.
Oh, interesting. I never really heard that take. I mean, I can see where it would come from, but just because they, have a issue with what they value and what they don't value, um,
What were some
they
of
probably
Eric's
allow people to walk over them quite a bit. But yeah,
What were some of his
um,
questions about that? Didn't he ask like
you know,
if you had to
yeah.
sacrifice a kitten or a puppy, which one would you choose or something?
Yeah. Would you rather sacrifice a puppy or a kitten? And the issue is, it's not really what your answer is, it's how you react to that question. And if you're FI polar, if you're anything but FI polar, you're gonna be like, what the hell kind of question is that? But if you're FI polar, you kind of think about it. Like, I don't know. And we should probably mention that FI and TI are the two deliberation functions, right? And so again, you're comparing FI to TI, not FI to FE or TI to TE. You're comparing TI to FI, and whether or not they have one of those two in their front stack. And the TI deliberation is the objective, logical, if P then Q, not Q then P, very systematic, very logical. And it's checking on validity, it's checking on accuracy, it's checking on, is something true or not or correct. Um, where FI is more, of course, value based, and it's not, is it true, in the real sense, but is it fair or is it ethical? Or, at a very minimal level, does it have value to me or does it not have value to me? But you sort of layer that, that system on top of itself, and you can get real deep ethical kind of, deliberations. And um, so I think the what you're trying to tease apart is this sort of does the person rely on sort of subjective deliberation or objective deliberation? So and I think he's got a pretty good um, stable of TI questions to where he can figure out if you're front stack TI or not, right? And so, in a lot of ways, he doesn't really need the FI questions as much because he has so many TI questions. And if you do, well enough on the TI stuff, then you're probably front stack TI and back stack FI. But there are people who do pretty well on TI questions that are TE users or what like good ISTJ. Um, so okay, so questions. I again he fully admits he doesn't really have a whole lot of FI questions. He'll sort of get to things like fairness and how easy is it for somebody to talk about sort of their ethics or their opinions. Um, you know they're about like he has a sort of open mic question, like if you had an open mic and you could tell the world, give the world any advice you wanted, what would you say? And again, it's not really like what you actually say or what your actual answer is. It's like how easy is it for you to sort of express
Right.
your morals, or are you the type of person who's just going to come up with something that everybody wants to hear, that kind of thing. And and, and in my real, just as an aside, I had a funny real world FI polar uh, run in the other night, sort of out in the wild, an FI polar test, where I had a friend who had pretty convinced is an ESTP, and so therefore FI polar. And we were out one night and we were talking to this girl and she was telling us the story about how she got drunk, like months ago. She got drunk and she like almost ran people over in her car in the parking lot. And just fair warning to everybody listening, don't do that. But so she's telling us this story, and his first question, his immediate reaction was, "Well, what type of car were you driving?" Right? Like nothing about the fact that she almost ran these people over, or who they were, or feeling, or how they're doing. Did anybody get hit? Did anybody get hurt? No, it was what kind of car were you driving? Now he was probably trying to figure out like what the extent of the damage would be. Like if it was in a big car or a little car, but it was just such an FI polar type of thing, right? That's just sort of like completely ignoring the ethics part of it and getting into this sort of like TITE type of question. Um, Anyways, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I mean, I would probably look at, if you really want to prod somebody, look at like the sort of questions, additional like questions, the types of things, the types of questions where they say, sociopaths fail these, because they don't have any empathy and they don't have any ethics, those sorts of questions. You're probably familiar with the Trump question, right? If it's gonna, it's going to hit it's going to hit 5 people, or you could change the gear or the pathway and it'll hit one person. What do? Do you let it hit the one person, or do you let it hit the 5 people? And it's not so much what your answer is, but it's your ability to think through it and talk through it. And do you look at it from a purely TI perspective, like, well, it's better to only lose one person versus 5, because one is better than 5, and that's it, or do you have it, or can you look at it from different angles, right? And not just that baseline TI angle.
Right. Um, Tech Tidbits has an excellent point there about asking for favors. An ENTP will ask to stay at your house when you're only acquaintances. So true. He really hit the nail on the head with that one. Um, it's this lack of understanding, having a good moral compass, that can be one thing. Unable to rank things is another. And then, the inability to come up with moral distinctions, regardless of what they are, as you mentioned. Um, if we can, I'd like to talk a little bit about possible TI questions as well. Um, I find that in the course of conversation with someone, you can start to find contradictions in their way of thinking sometimes. And what's more, perhaps, is the inability to make a distinction between one's opinion and the truth. I know
Right.
Ben Shapiro's made the phrase famous, the facts don't care about your feelings. I have
Yeah, that's
friends
classic
who cannot
Polar stuff.
make that distinction. They literally,
Right.
like, they'll bet on their football team against the defending Super Bowl champs when their team is like 2-10. They'll still put their money on their team because that's my team. And it's like, where's your logic there? Like, I can bet against my favorite team if I think they're going to lose. Also, the inability to judge information on its own merit as opposed to making a judgment of who the person is. What I mean by that, you could be my worst enemy in the world, and if you say 2 + 2 = 4, I'm going to declare that you are telling the truth. I think TI polar people have a problem with things like that sometimes. It's like if they don't like someone, that everything they say like is bad or wrong. Like they don't know how to parse out logic from their personal feelings very well.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, especially if whatever you're arguing goes against their, what they would conclude from an FI standpoint, right? So, I usually think of FI and TI deliberation as like legal issues or political issues. That's usually a pretty good framework, right? Because you have a lot of politicians that are making TI arguments or political hacks, or they're the policy people are making TI arguments about inflation and unemployment and all this minimum wage versus no minimum wage and tariffs and taxes and very very TI type of stuff, right? Very ENTP like, but then you have this whole other swath of politicians and policy people that don't care about that TI stuff, right? Like you might be right, okay, yeah, our taxes might go up, or yeah, inflation might go up, but I've got constituents who are starving, and they need help right now, and we'll deal with all that TI stuff later, right? When we need to, but let's do the FI stuff right now and take care of the ethical issue. Um, and that's a large part of what Washington D.C. is the battle between these TI arguments and FI arguments. And you certainly see it on CNN and all the talking head shows where somebody will be making the TI argument and then the other person's making the FI argument, and there's no resolution there because they're arguing about different things, right? They're using different deliberation methods, but they're coming to a conclusion, vote yes or vote no, right? But the way that they come to that conclusion, the way they're deliberating it, is one is using TI and one is using FI, and what do you do, in that situation? And as far as polar testing people, I think having conversations like that. I mean, you have to be pretty savvy at the TI stuff or the FI stuff, to really engage in somebody, get in the banter with them. But I think if you could do that or find examples of questions, sort of those like drinking game questions where they're sort of ethical questions, or sort of get to know people type of questions. Again, they're just sort of ethical questions of, if you found $100, what would you do kind of stuff. You might be able to tease it out that way.
Right.
Yeah, and the people who are TI polar, again, they're the ENFPs, the ESFPs, and they blame the ENFPs for all the postmodernism, and there is no objective truth, and it's all just the patriarchy shoving the grand narrative down everybody's throats, and it's our job to destroy the system from within, because there is no real objective truth out there, objective morals. If you get somebody on one of those tirades, they're probably TI polar.
Right. Right. And you can even start with some soft questions, how are they about following rules? What do they think of uniforms at work?
Yeah.
What would they do if they're an athlete and they hate the color orange and they get drafted to a team that orange is their team colors? How they, when weird things like that throw a wrench in their feelings. Well, I would wear my own color shoes anyway or something. I don't care about the rules,
Right.
or I'm not going to wear my
Yeah, the
name
prima donna
screen.
athletes. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you can start catching those things, and you can see like a good example. Cristiano Ronaldo's typed as an ESFP, both in MBTI and in socionics. That would make him TI polar, and you can see a lot of his decisions. Like now he's playing, in the Middle East to make more money, even though he's away from his family group, his friend group. I mean, he makes enough money, God knows where he can move them all with them. But you could see, different situations where he's put his own interest above his teams, like with the national team playing, and he sits on the bench because he doesn't like that he's not getting enough time. Things that don't really make sense in a practical, logical sort of way, but he lets his feelings kind of get in the way. When you see a pattern like that in someone's behavior, that's when it's time to start looking for possible polar TI.
Yeah. Yeah. But on the flip side, though, I mean, I don't want to completely bag on FI and come across as if somebody relies on FI and not TI, that they're a complete basket case, because sometimes they make good points, and I find that INFPs and ISFPs, you know mainly INFPs, I mean, they do a really good. Those who have like the NDI, the typology channels and stuff, they do a really good job of sort of explaining things and telling things as if it's a story. And so there's definitely some I guess some poetry or some aesthetics that sort of comes with at least the lead FI users. My daughter is an ISFP, and so she's a lead FI user, and she's definitely, you know, got her political beliefs and all that. But really, when it comes down to it, she's just really artsy, just likes, cool things, right? Just because they're cool, right? And I find a charm in that, in a lot of ways. But again, we're not talking polar here. So, um, the ESFPs and the ENFPs, I like to think, Kanye West and Dave Chappelle sort of strike me as either ESFP or ENFP for various reasons, but mainly because, I think they're TI polar because of these examples where they have these notorious fights with the record industry or the TV studio industry over their contracts, because their contracts say, you know here's what's going to happen. If A happens, then you're going to get this. If B happens, then you're going to get this. If C happens, then you're going to get this. They signed it. They made a bunch of money. They got really famous, and then all of a sudden they take a look at their contract and they say, well, that's not fair, right? Like, I know it's what the contract says, and I know logically that's, what I'm entitled to under the contract, but it's not fair. You totally screwed me, because I was young and had no say in the matter, and my own lawyers were in on the game, and they weren't looking out for my best interest. They were, looking out for yours. And so they notoriously, and Prince is another one, notoriously had these fights over their contracts because, again, to me, it's an example of being TI polar, or at least not paying attention to the TI part of it, or being satisfied with the TI part of it, and immediately going to the FI part and just saying, this isn't fair. This isn't fair to me, and I don't care what I signed. I don't care what the contract says, all that TI stuff. I'm not listening to that argument. I only care what's fair to me, right? And part of me agrees with them. Like the lawyer
Right.
in me is like, you gotta abide by the contract. You signed it. But the other part of me knows that, like how the industry is shaped, and yeah, they probably did have lawyers who weren't looking out for their best interest, and yeah, they probably should rely on the fact that this is like not fair and this is inequitable. So rooting for Kanye, sort of rooting for Dave Chappelle, even though it's kind of polar thing, right?
But, again, whether to whatever degree they're right or not, people with TI polar are very difficult to argue with. They,
Yeah,
you can't find common ground from which you can grow a reasoned conversation with to agree or disagree. I find a lot of times if you're in disagreement, you're probably going to stay there, and you have to appeal to FE or FI strategies to help get yourselves out of that hole.
yeah. No, I would agree because I mean, usually FI arguments are first principle arguments, right? I mean, do you come at it from, lack of a better term, a conservative approach versus a liberal approach versus a libertarian approach? And if you're coming from it, from different first principles, there's, yeah, you're not going to convince the other person to change their first principles, other than maybe just waiting 20 years, right? And they might grow out of it, but other than that, yeah, I mean, it's really just, it's a war of attrition, right? It's just throwing fire on fire and trying to figure out who, runs out of materials fast enough. That's what the Twitter fights are, and the CNN fights, and the MSNBC, fights are. They're not intended to come to a conclusion that everybody can agree upon. I mean, if they did that, then nobody would be getting paid in DC anymore. All the political strategists would get fired if all of a sudden we all agreed.
Right.
So there's a lot of money to be made and a lot of, jobs to be had and political discontent. But we do our best, and some people are better at it than others, and sometimes it's just fun to just sit back and you know watch them go at it.
Right. Before we move on, what did I know? I've already mentioned early in our conversation that Eric's way of testing for TI that I know of is he does like rapid fire logical connection arguments, such
Yeah,
as, you know, what is your mother's brother's father's sister's son to you, and you have to think fast and figure out that's my second cousin, and if you can't follow it, then he starts looking in that direction as a possible polar
right.
function. Does he have any other ones that you're aware of besides that?
Yeah. I mean, he'll do just general logic questions, right? Like, you know, um, all poodles are dogs. A beagle is a dog. Is a beagle therefore a poodle,
Right.
right? And yes or no, and can you come to the logical conclusion? And then like the if somebody answers correctly, he'll give them a more difficult one and a more difficult one. And these are sort of logic 101 questions, but they get harder and harder. And he does a good job of sort of scaling up the difficulty. Um, and so somebody with really strong TI, it's like an INTP or an ISTP, they do really well at those, and you'll just see them sort of scale up. Um, and then he does this other one where he'll, say, hey, you got 4 hootenannies to a barrel and 7 barrels to a quagmire. How many hootenannies are in a quagmire? And it's just to see if you can, ignore the goofy language and just think of it purely in symbolic terms and just run through the math, right? And it's the same way with the family stuff. Is he's trying to see, can you manipulate symbols and relationships among the symbols in your head, flexibly and quickly, right?
Right.
And
And you can't
that's why.
cheat that. There's no cheating that one. Like if you can't do it, you're spot on. You're found out.
Well, I mean, it's the nature of the function, right? The function is trying to figure out what's correct. So it's the one function where there really is a correct answer, right?
Right.
Because it's the function that is trying to figure out what's correct.
So maybe
Everything else, an
it,
approximation, yeah.
right. It may be the easiest one to test for. out of all 8.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of being correct, right, or accurate. Yeah.
All right.
Now,
Go ahead.
Sometimes when somebody comes out as like TI polar or lower TI, sometimes it might just be like one thing that you see a lot in the TI polar or people with low TI is that he'll say something like, okay, all bananas are ducks and all ducks are fly fishermen. So, is a banana necessarily a fly fisherman? And the person will get caught up on, wait, bananas are not ducks. Like in reality, right? Bananas, what do bananas and ducks have to do with each other? And what do fly fishermen and bananas have to do with each other? And not realizing that these are just variables, right? He's using that have, yeah, real world meaning, but they're really just variables, in the equation. And you're not supposed to get caught up on the actual meaning of a banana or a duck or a fisherman, right? He could have said all A's are B's and all B's are C's, so it's an A, a C, and that would be a lot easier for a lot of people. But he intentionally does it using real world words because I think it confuses people with, you know, backstack TI because they get caught up on what do bananas have to do with ducks, right? And not understanding that, we're talking just symbols here.
Right.
So you in the TI polar types. And then, yeah, and I remember with mine, um, I did fine on the family stuff. He didn't really ask me many logic questions, but the one question that he did ask, like the other guy who was doing the testing sort of jumped in and tried to answer, and it was like, hey, you're not the one being tested here. And so they had this whole like back and forth between each other. And so I didn't really full TI barrage out of my session, but I did fine enough to show its front stack. But yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm ready to move on to our final coin, for lack of a better term, SE and NE. I'd like to start by saying I think that SE ought to be pretty easy to test for asking questions. And, regardless of the system you're most comfortable with, it would have to do with, physical agility and mobility, whether that's sports, fighting, dancing, fitness, ability to take pain, ability to move furniture, ability, how difficult is it for you to get up and get moving? And again, this can be a tough one between inferior SE versus polar SE.
Mm-hmm.
But I think with if you're polar, you can see it pretty quickly. Like I think. I mean, that's because that one, if TI's the easiest one in that it has a right and a wrong answer, I think SE is the one that we can relate to physical ability or not necessarily force like it is in socionics, but just physical aptitude, just like TI in some ways it's mental aptitude. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, SE and any to me are the most difficult, to be honest. Mainly because I think it's hard to explain what exactly these functions are doing, and I don't even know if I have a great explanation for it. But again, computationally speaking, I think what it's doing is it's your problem space that you're dealing with in sort of the here and now. And I think of it as sort of your sandbox that you play in. So it's both sort of your action area, but also the area where you're gathering information from it, right? And it's either physical world stuff or any metaphysical world stuff. And to me, it's actually, I don't know, maybe easier for me sort of peg an any user, especially a high any user, first or second, because they can talk. They just talk, 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 talk. And they just banter, 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 and they can go in any direction, right? Um, and so you'll see him, like you'll see him. You can tell he gets a little giddy when he has somebody who he thinks is probably like an ENTP or an ENFP, where they're lead NE, because he'll start getting into these like banter sessions with them and just talking about ridiculous stuff, right? And I think he's just trying to see, hey, can I take this person along this trip, to this in these ridiculous ways, right? But then you compare that to an ISFP or an ISTP, and they are the exact opposite. And you almost know, like within the first 30 seconds, if somebody's going to come out as ISFP or ISTP, because they do not talk at all, right? Unless they're asked to, right? And,
Right.
and the answers that they give are just the bare minimum, right?
Yep.
And sometimes he'll sort of get them to open up, and they'll start talking about stuff, like especially like if they're into something like music, or like those, if they have sort of a passion, especially like an ISFP, if if he finds that, then maybe they'll start opening up and talking. But in general, like the first 30 seconds, a couple of minutes, they are just dead silent. They're just sort of like, uh-huh, 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 and he'll do the, tell me about your day. Well, I got up like I always do. I went to work. Okay.
Right.
And so go back and watch some of those videos, and you'll get what I'm talking about. And so any polar to me is pretty easy to suss out, because they just don't talk. And it's almost like a lot of times I feel like they don't even understand what they're being asked to do. Like they're just kind of like, well, this is weird. Why is he asking me to do this? Especially if they aren't familiar with the channel or the typing sessions. They're the ones who sort of get confused about what's going on. And I think that's probably in any polar thing. Like, where are we, right? In this
Right.
any world. Why are you asking me to do all this weird shit? Because they're in physical real world, right? And he's taking them into any world, and it doesn't make sense to them, right? And then like asking them, like, hey, it's a story. I walked into a bowling alley with my peacock and asked for a set of shoes, and the guy said, hey, we don't serve peacocks here. You got to leave. And then he'll say, finish the story, and they're just like, okay, well, I guess I took my peacock and left. Right? Like they went with living in that little world that he created, which is the indie world, right? But finding somebody who's SE polar, that's harder to me, to be honest. Like, I know that like the typical explanation or observation, they're procrastinators. They don't know when to pull the trigger. They'll sort of deliberate on things. It's the classic absent-minded professor who, has a book chapter that they need to get done, and they've just been working on it and working and working on it. They just can't get it done because nothing's ever 100% correct and done for them. And so it's that constant, like, just you're in the process constantly. These are P's, right? These are perceiver types, who are going to be as, and so it's that's sort of the classic example, or sorry, SE polar. But how do you suss that out? I don't know, other than just sort of real world examples, right?
Yeah, I would say again, I would go back to what they're like physically, if they ever played sports, if they are active, if they work out, do they like or shy away from competition of any kind? You can have low SC and still be competitive. I know INFJs and INTJs who, their SE isn't high, but they still don't want to come in last. They
Yeah.
still have some willpower. Um, I find polar SE would be just very anti-confrontational, um, just very meek and mild, Clark Kent style people. As for NE
Yeah.
polar, well, I don't want to be NE myself and be jumping around, but just real quickly, I would say they're almost the opposite in that they have that same attitude when it comes to ideas. They don't like to speculate. This is anecdotal, but these are things that can start pointing you in that direction. One truth, one reality to a fault. They can't see alternatives. They see, there's another way to do this. They're very strict minded. Even when their methods stop working, they stay the course anyway. Um, to
Are you
me,
talking?
when you see that pattern, that's like any polar. So I think I said my
Oh,
two
okay. You're
cents.
talking getting polar. Okay, gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because I was going to say SE polar, the INTPs and the INFPs, like they're constantly changing their mind. And
No, right.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
it's the
Okay.
same principle of the similarities equal the similarities in the polar function. Just one's
Yeah,
polar physically, the other's polar ideationally, in terms of alternatives and variety.
yeah. Well, I mean, one thing on the INTP INFP point about being SE polar. So I would agree that they're not aggressive in the physical world sense, like an ESTP or an ESFP would be, right? An ESTP, like Donald Trump, like you watch him, he's constantly like moving things on the desk and like moving people out of the way. Like he is very dominant in his space, right? He likes to plant his flag or like to hold his ground in physical space, right? That's just how he's always been, right? And that's a very ESTP, lead SP type of person. And I think INTPs and INFPs are kind of like that, not as much as ENTPs and ENFPs, but they're kind of like that in the any space. If you think of the any space as sort of the verbal domain, like they can be very aggressive in that domain, and they will stake their ground in the verbal domain and say no, you're wrong. Like they're the people who are constantly swooping in and leaving comments on the YouTube channel about how we're wrong about everything, right? And so they're very aggressive in staking their ground in the NE world, in the ideas kind of world, but they're certainly not aggressive in the physical world, right? And so I think you have to sort of parse that out when you say, if you say that an INFP or an INTP is you know, sort of a wilted flower or, a wallflower, sort of non-dominant. That's certainly true in the physical world, right? Like at the dance, they're the ones standing against the wall. That's certainly true, right? But on the internet comments, they're like front and center firing on all cylinders. it's it,
Agreed.
it's very
Absolutely.
yeah.
That's weird. That I don't know what that means, but I'm almost more aggressive physically than I am on the internet. Like I take great care. Like I've never been banned or anything like that. Like I've always been courteous and
Oh yeah, well, you're an
I'm more
SJ.
likely to have road rage than get in a sparring match with someone online.
Yeah,
You
now
know
you
that
think long term, so you're an SJ, so
yeah,
you're not
interesting.
caught up in that kind of stuff. That's all for ENTPs and INTPs. And
Right.
the INTJs like to troll, but they will troll you for years. Like for them, it's like this
Right.
long-term plan to ruin your life. Right? The INTPs and the ENTPs, they just swoop in and tell you that you're stupid and you're ugly, and then they move on to the next person. Right? Um, ISTJs will just, they'll let it simmer, and they'll find some way to, to completely ruin your life if they wanted to. But yeah. So, anyways, okay. So, I mean, so I guess with SE and NE, to me, a lot of it's just about staking that ground, right? And if you're SE polar, you're not really going to stake much ground in the physical world, but you're certainly going to do it in the non-physical world, the verbal world, where, and then to your point, the ISTPs and the ISFPs that are NE polar, um, they're less likely to stake their ground, in the verbal world. A lot of times they just
Right.
they're just Luke, and they just don't care, right? You can like I have an ISTP son and an ISFP daughter, and both of them, like, I try to give them my little INFJ advice all the time, and they're like, yeah, all right, cool. They just move on to what they're doing. And they're like, well, think about it. Isn't this cool? Yeah, yeah, that's so cool,
Right.
Dad.
You know,
So yeah.
this is a general observation, but a lot of the questions or types of questions that we've put out there tonight, even if they in and of themselves cannot by themselves identify a polar function in a person,
Mm-hmm.
with any aptitude at all, it can exclude that as a polar function. It's the
Right.
kind of thing where, like, maybe I can't tag you as an SE polar, but I can tag that either you're definitely not SE polar or you still might be. And once you get through all 8, now you're down to some finalists. And from there, you can ask some further clarifying and enlightening questions and get the answers you're looking for.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's another sort of beauty of the system. So, for example, if somebody thinks I'm an ENFP because I'm constantly doing any ramblings on my video, they're like, God, this guy, he's always doing any stuff. Well, go back and watch my typing session, and if I legitimately were an ENFP, I would be TI polar, and I can assure you, I am not TI polar. So I'm not. I might be something other than INFJ. I'll give you that, but not ENFP, right? And that's the beauty of the system, is you can point to something that you are capable, clearly capable of doing, without a whole lot of difficulty, and be able to say, okay, well, if I were such and such type, I would be polar in this function, and I'm not polar in this function, so I'm clearly not that type, right? And that's the logical consistency of the methodology and the system. It's kind of like those logic problems where they give you sort of a scenario and they say Mary's wearing a green shirt and Sally lives in room 7 and Chuck and Steve live next to Sally, and you're supposed to like figure out what the answer is through process of elimination, right? And that's basically what you're doing with this methodology.
Absolutely.
So, okay, well, cool. I
All
mean,
right.
it's about 10:38. I know we wanted to do an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And we got through all 4 functions. I think we did a fair amount of damage to all
Yeah,
of them.
definitely.
Yeah,
So,
and I think on both of our channels we can do maybe a little follow-up video ourselves and clarify any lingering questions of people who watch later and fast forward and rewind and get stuck on one point or another, and we can kind of get to those as they come and take things from there.
yeah. So I know a lot of people have been leaving comments, and I've been horrible at reading them. So I don't know if they're going to disappear after we turn this off. So I apologize if they do. If anybody had sort of a comment that they wanted us to address and these disappear, feel free to leave it again on the video itself, and I'll try to react. But I'm having a hard time. My eyes just have a hard time reading these right now. So hopefully they'll last. And if they don't, please come back with a comment, and I'll try to address it. If I think I have a good answer.
Absolutely. And I do think they will stay, and because I've seen them stay on your other videos.
Okay.
And the comments were basically standalone. They were more comments as opposed to questions. So I think we're
Okay.
good
Cool.
there. But hey, I really appreciate the time and having me on as a
Yeah.
guest. It was fun.
Fine.
Um, it's always fun talking to you, and I hope we can do it again another time.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anybody has any suggestions of something that they want us to banter on about, certainly let us know. Um, and if you caught us, saying something incorrect, all you INTPs out there, let us know, and we'll correct the record. So, okay. Well, thanks again,
All
and
right.
yeah, touch, and we'll find something else to talk about next time.
All right. Thanks.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye.